June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. A single bomb punches through the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Akagi and detonates in the hangar below. In less than 90 seconds, fuel lines rupture, torpedoes cook off, and the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy turns into a floating furnace. Within 6 minutes, 2 more Japanese carriers are burning the exact same way. By nightfall, the balance of power in the Pacific Ocean has been erased. But if you rewind the clock just 8 days, none of this was supposed to happen. The United States Navy did not have enough carriers to win this fight. Not on paper. Not by any calculation the Japanese admirals had run. And the reason America even showed up to that battle with a full hand instead of an empty one has almost nothing to do with pilots or admirals or secret codes. It has to do with a few thousand men in oil-stained coveralls who were told their job was impossible and who did it anyway in 72 hours flat. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exciting videos. Join us as we explore more untold stories, historic events, and inspiring moments from the past. His name has been lost to time, buried somewhere in a stack of Navy Yard time cards that nobody thought to save. History books call men like him shipfitters, or welders, or simply yard workers. A faceless mass of labor mentioned in a single footnote. But without him, and about 1,400 men exactly like him, the Battle of Midway does not happen the way you think it happened. 3 American carriers went into that battle. By every rule of naval engineering in 1942, there should only have been 2. The math is almost impossible to believe. 90 days. That was the official estimate. 90 days to repair the damage that was about to sail into Pearl Harbor. They had 3. To understand why those 3 days mattered so much, you have to go back 6 months earlier to a Sunday morning that changed everything. December 7th, 1941. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers hit Pearl Harbor in under 2 hours and left 8 American battleships sunk or crippled at their moorings. It was a catastrophe, but it was an incomplete one. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that would actually decide the next 4 years of war in the Pacific, were out at sea that morning untouched. Purely by accident, the most important weapons in the entire American arsenal survived. For the next 6 months, Japan pressed every advantage that mistake handed them. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines fell. Singapore, supposedly an impregnable British fortress, fell in 70 days. Japanese carrier aircraft struck as far away as Ceylon, sinking British ships in the Indian Ocean like it was target practice. There seemed to be nothing that could slow them down. Then, on May 8, 1942, in the Coral Sea, northeast of Australia, American and Japanese carriers fought each other directly for the first time in history. Neither side's ships ever saw the other. It was fought entirely by aircraft launched from decks hundreds of miles apart. The result was a tactical draw dressed up as a strategic win. Japan lost a light carrier and had a fleet carrier badly mauled. America lost the carrier Lexington gutted by internal explosions and scuttled by her own escorts. And the 3rd American carrier in that fight, the USS Yorktown, took a direct hit from an 800-pound bomb that punched clean through 4 decks before it exploded deep in her guts. She survived. Barely. She limped back toward Pearl Harbor, trailing oil and listing to one side. Her flight deck buckled entire compartments, flooded her structural frames, cracked like a dropped plate that somebody had glued back together. Naval engineers who inspected the preliminary damage reports back at Pearl Harbor did not sugarcoat it. 90 days minimum. Some said 120. That was how long it would take to make the Yorktown fit to fight again. Here is the problem nobody in Washington wanted to say out loud. American codebreakers working in a windowless basement beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor had just cracked the core of the Japanese naval code. And what they had decoded was terrifying in its clarity. Japan was about to throw everything it had at a tiny American outpost called Midway Atoll, less than 1,300 miles from Hawaii itself. 4 Japanese fleet carriers. Over 200 warships in total. The single largest naval task force ever assembled to that point in human history, all steaming toward one objective with the explicit goal of finishing off whatever remained of the American Pacific Fleet once and for all. Admiral Chester Nimitz had exactly 2 healthy carriers to throw against that wall of steel. Enterprise and Hornet. 2 against 4. And every strategist on his staff knew that 2 carriers going up against 4 was not a fight, it was a funeral with extra steps. Nimitz needed a 3rd carrier. There was only one available anywhere in the Pacific, and she was steaming toward Pearl Harbor right now, with a hole blown through her hull big enough to drive a truck through. This is where our nameless welder walks into the story. Picture Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard on the morning of May 27, 1942. Dry dock number 1 is already occupied by the battleship Pennsylvania, so workers scramble to shift ships around just to make room. The air smells like scorched metal and seawater. Cranes groan overhead. Men in grease-streaked dungarees move in and out of the yard in 12-hour shifts that never seem to actually end, because the moment one shift technically finishes, half the men just keep working anyway. This was a world of steady, unglamorous, backbreaking labor. Riveters, pipe fitters, electricians, boilermakers, and welders, hundreds of them men who spent their war not firing a rifle, but crouched inside dark, superheated compartments with a torch in one hand and a mask fogging up with sweat-patching steel that other men had blown apart. Most of them were too old, too young, or medically unfit for combat duty. The Navy needed them exactly where they were. Most had families a few miles away in Honolulu. Some had lost friends on Battleship Row less than 6 months earlier and walked past the wrecks of the Arizona and the Oklahoma every single day on their way into the yard, a permanent reminder of exactly what was at stake. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor at 10 o'clock in the morning that Wednesday, workers say the smell hit them before the ship was even in visual range. Burnt fuel oil, scorched paint, seawater gone rancid in flooded compartments that had been sealed for days. She rode low and crooked in the water. As she eased into dry dock number 1 and the water was pumped out to expose her hull, the scale of the damage became visible for the first time, and it was worse than anyone expected. A hole roughly 30 feet wide punched through her side. Buckled steel plating peeled back like the lid of a tin can. Entire fuel bunkers ruptured and leaking. Internal frames twisted so badly that in places the corridors no longer lined up straight. One engineer looking at the wreckage from the bottom of the dry dock reportedly said, "It looked less like battle damage and more like the ship had been dropped from a height." That same morning, Admiral Nimitz himself walked down into the dry dock in his khakis, climbed over the debris, and inspected the wound personally alongside his senior repair officers. What he said next is the part of this story that sounds completely insane if you know anything about how naval engineering actually worked in 1942. He turned to the yard commander and told him the Yorktown needed to be ready to sail in 3 days. 3 days. Not 3 weeks. 3 days. The engineers in that dry dock had spent their entire careers following procedure, following blueprints, following the kind of rigid safety protocols that exist specifically to prevent a warship from breaking apart at sea. Structural repairs of this scale were supposed to take months, not because the Navy enjoyed paperwork, but because a ship that goes back to war with unfinished internal repairs can literally crack in half under the stress of high-speed maneuvering. Senior repair officers pushed back immediately. It was reckless. It was ridiculous. Some later admitted privately they thought it was borderline suicidal to even attempt it both for the ship and for the men who would be sailing on her half-repaired hull straight into the largest naval battle in Pacific history. Nimitz did not budge. He did not have the luxury of budging. He had the decrypted Japanese battle plan sitting on his desk, and he knew Midway was coming in exactly 8 days. So the impossible became the plan. Somewhere around 1,400 workers were pulled onto the Yorktown repair job almost simultaneously. Welders, electricians, ship fitters, riveters, carpenters, all crammed into a single hull at the same time in numbers that violated every normal safety guideline the yard had ever used. Work crews stopped rotating in shifts and instead just kept going, sleeping in short bursts on cots dragged into the dry dock itself, so nobody wasted time walking home and back. Cranes lowered massive prefabricated steel patches down into the gash in Yorktown's hull patches that were being cut and shaped on the spot, because there had been no time to design them properly beforehand. Inside the ship, welders worked in compartments so choked with smoke from cutting torches that men had to rotate out every 20 minutes just to breathe. Temporary wooden bracing shored up steel frames that would normally have been fully replaced. Entire sections of decking got welded shut rather than properly rebuilt, sealed just well enough to survive the next engagement, and not one day longer. For our nameless welder, this meant something almost unimaginable. Somewhere in that first 24 hours, crouched in a scorched compartment 3 decks down, his torch cutting through jagged, twisted steel that had been ripped apart by a Japanese bomb less than 3 weeks earlier. He was told something that must have sounded like a joke. Forget finishing the job. Forget making it perfect. Just make it good enough to fight. Naval engineering, the way it had always been taught, said this was madness. You do not send a wounded warship back into the deadliest ocean battle of the century with patch jobs and prayer. But the men in that dry dock were not naval engineers weighing theoretical risk anymore. They were watching the clock, and somewhere on the other side of the Pacific, 4 Japanese carriers were already burning fuel toward Midway. By the second day, work had spread to almost every accessible compartment on the ship simultaneously. Fire hoses, welding cables, and temporary lighting rigs snaked through every corridor. Officers who tried to walk a straight line through the ship often had to climb over active work crews, and still it was not enough. As the deadline closed in Navy, planners made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Repair crews would remain aboard, working even after the ship left dry dock, even after she got underway. On the morning of May 30th, just 3 days after arriving as a broken smoking wreck, the USS Yorktown eased out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, streaming smoke, her flight deck patched generators still being wired, below welders and electricians, still working compartment by compartment as she steamed north to meet Task Force 17. Hundreds of yard workers, our welder likely among them, stayed aboard for the first stretch of the journey, finishing critical repairs. Even as the ship left port, some of them only transferring off by boat. Once the essential work was done, watching the carrier they had rebuilt with their own hands disappear over the horizon toward a fight. Nobody outside a locked room in Pearl Harbor even knew was coming. What they had done should not have been possible. A repair yard had taken a warship gutted by an 800-pound bomb and pushed it back to sea in 72 hours, a fraction of the time anyone thought achievable, using improvisation instead of procedure and raw manpower instead of time. Nobody in that dry dock knew yet whether it had actually worked. Nobody knew if those hurried welds would hold under combat maneuvering, whether that patched hull could survive another direct hit, whether 3 sleepless days had actually saved the ship or simply delayed her sinking by a week. They would find out very soon. 5 days later, on the morning of June 4, 1942, the USS Yorktown took her place alongside Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway Atoll, exactly where American codebreakers had predicted the Japanese fleet would appear. Task Force 17 held its position in near total radio silence, waiting. And at 4:30 that morning, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, launched the opening wave of their attack on Midway Island, unaware that anything but an empty ocean waited for them to the northeast. What happened over the next 6 hours became one of the single greatest reversals in military history. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment decks, packed with fuel and armed aircraft, and in a matter of minutes, turned 3 of Japan's finest carriers into burning wrecks. Yorktown's own air group played a direct role in that reversal. Her dive bombers launched from a flight deck that 72 hours earlier had been a smoking ruin at the bottom of a dry dock, found the carrier Soryu, and put her out of the war permanently. Think about that for a second. A ship that engineers said needed 90 days to repair was 8 days later launching the very aircraft that helped sink an enemy fleet carrier. The men who told Nimitz his plan was impossible were technically correct. It should not have worked. It worked anyway. Word of the strike rippled back through the fleet, and for a few electric hours, it looked like American forces had pulled off one of the great ambushes in naval history. 3 Japanese carriers burning at once, their aircraft destroyed on deck before they ever had a chance to launch a counterattack, their most experienced pilots trapped in the inferno below. On the Yorktown, sailors, who had watched yard workers swarm their ship just over a week earlier, now stood on a flight deck that had somehow held together through combat maneuvers, launches, and recoveries, exactly as those exhausted welders had promised it would. But somewhere out there beyond visual range, a 4th Japanese carrier was still very much alive. Hiryu had escaped the morning slaughter entirely, and her air crews watching 3 sister ships burn on the horizon were not thinking about retreat. They were thinking about revenge. And they knew exactly which American flight deck had just launched the bombers that gutted their fleet. The men who had rebuilt the Yorktown in 72 hours had bought her just enough life to fight one great battle. Whether that patched, hurried, impossible repair job could survive what Hiryu was about to send at her was a question none of them could answer yet. That answer was coming that same afternoon, and it would ask everything of that ship and everyone still aboard her all over again. The bomb that gutted the Yorktown was supposed to end her war. 72 hours later, that same ship steamed into the most decisive naval battle in American history and helped burn 3 Japanese carriers to the waterline in a single morning. That is where we left off. Enterprise Hornet and the impossibly repaired Yorktown had just pulled off one of the great ambushes in naval warfare. Akagi Kaga and Soryu were dying on the horizon, their flight decks torn open, their most experienced pilots trapped below in a floating inferno. For a few hours, it looked like the war in the Pacific had just been won in a single stroke. But one Japanese carrier had survived the slaughter completely untouched, Hiryu. And her air crews watching 3 sister ships burn from a distance were not thinking about retreat. They were thinking about revenge. Somewhere out there, Japanese scout planes had already spotted the American task force, and they had radioed back one detail that mattered more than anything else in that moment. They had located the flight deck that launched the bombers responsible for the massacre. It was noon on June 4, 1942. Nobody aboard the Yorktown yet knew that the ship, rebuilt in 72 hours flat, was about to be tested in the single worst way imaginable, twice in the span of one afternoon. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something that almost nobody outside the ship itself knew. The men who had welded the Yorktown back together at Pearl Harbor never actually finished the job. They ran out of time. Entire compartments below the waterline were still held together with temporary bracing instead of properly replaced steel. Fuel bunkers that should have been fully rebuilt had been sealed with patch plates cut and shaped on the fly tack, welded under conditions no engineering manual would have approved. The ship that just helped win the morning battle at Midway was, structurally speaking, still a half-repaired hull running on borrowed time. And every damage control officer aboard her knew it. There had been genuine argument about this back at Pearl Harbor, argument that never made it into any press release. Some of the yard's senior structural engineers wanted the repair schedule extended even by a single week, warning that a ship patched this fast, this crudely could not be trusted to survive a second serious hit. They were overruled. Not because their concerns were wrong, but because the alternative was worse. A Yorktown sitting safely in dry dock for 90 days was a Yorktown that would arrive at Midway exactly one carrier short of what Nimitz needed to win. The engineers who pushed back were not fools. They were doing their jobs. They simply lost the argument to a deadline that could not move because the Japanese fleet was not going to wait for American paperwork to catch up. So when Yorktown's radar operators picked up a formation of incoming aircraft at 12 noon on June 4th, roughly 32 miles out, and closing fast, every man on that ship who understood what was welded together beneath the waterline felt the same specific dread. This was the test nobody wanted. Not a controlled exercise with observers taking notes on a clipboard. A live fire test at sea against 18 Japanese dive bombers, escorted by 6 fighters, with the entire outcome of the morning's victory hanging on whether 3 days of welding could survive what 90 days was supposed to guarantee. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to clear for action. Fuel lines that could be drained were drained. Hangar deck aircraft were pushed toward the edges. Anti-aircraft crews loaded their guns and waited. Below decks, the men who had spent those 72 hours in Pearl Harbor with torches in their hands were now standing at their damage control stations because dozens of the actual yard workers had stayed aboard, still technically finishing repairs when the ship sailed. They were about to find out in the most brutal way possible whether their own work would hold. The Japanese strike came in high using cloud cover to mask their approach, and Yorktown's fighter cover intercepted them late. Zeros tangled with American Wildcats overhead while the Val dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. Yorktown's anti-aircraft gunners threw up a wall of fire so dense that eyewitnesses later said the sky over the ship looked black with bursting shells. It worked partially. Of the 18 dive bombers in that strike, gunners and fighters cut the formation down hard before it could deliver its payload cleanly. But 3 bombs got through. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the number 2 elevator and detonated, tearing a hole roughly 10 feet across and killing or wounding gun crews stationed nearby. The second hit the funnel casing, and this was the one that should have ended the fight right there. It knocked out boiler uptakes, choked 3 of Yorktown's 6 boilers with smoke and gas, and reduced her speed from 20 knots to a dead stop within minutes. A carrier with no speed in the middle of an active naval battle is a stationary target waiting for the next wave to arrive and finish the job. The third bomb punched down through the flight deck and several decks below before exploding, starting a fire dangerously close to a fuel storage compartment in almost the exact same kind of confined space where a single spark had turned Akagi into a funeral pyre a few hours earlier. For a period of minutes, it looked like this half-repaired ship was about to suffer the identical fate as the Japanese carriers she had just helped destroy that same morning. This was the moment the 72 hours in Pearl Harbor either mattered or they didn't. They mattered. Damage control teams. Many of them. Yard workers still technically finishing their own repair job went straight into compartments that were on fire, dragging hoses through smoke so thick men had to feel their way along bulkheads. Below in the engineering spaces, engineers worked to reroute steam lines around the damaged boilers, patching pipe fittings with the same improvisational instinct that had rebuilt the hull 3 days earlier. Within 20 minutes, fires that could have reached the fuel bunkers were contained. Within an hour, engineers had rerouted enough boiler capacity to get the ship moving again. By roughly 1:40 in the afternoon, less than 90 minutes after taking 3 bomb hits that should have crippled her permanently, the Yorktown was making 19 knots, launching aircraft again and back in the fight. Think about what that number actually means: 19 knots. On a hull that engineers back at Pearl Harbor had warned might not survive a single serious hit. On patches that had been welded under a deadline nobody thought was survivable. The ship that skeptical engineers said needed 90 days had just absorbed 3 bomb hits and gotten back underway in under 2 hours. For a few precious minutes, word spread through the task force that Yorktown had shaken off the attack completely. Sailors on Enterprise watching from a distance reportedly cheered, but Hiryu was not finished. And this is where the afternoon turns from a story about survival into a story about how much a wounded ship can actually take before there is nothing left to give. Around 2:30 that afternoon, Yorktown's radar picked up a second formation. Inbound this time torpedo bombers, 10 of them, escorted by fighters, closing from 2 directions to split her anti-aircraft fire. Every damage control officer aboard understood exactly what a torpedo hit meant that a bomb did not. Bombs damage a ship from above. Torpedoes tear open the hull below the waterline in exactly the kind of structural compartments that had been rushed through repair in Pearl Harbor. Patched rather than properly rebuilt, held together with bracing that was never meant to survive a direct underwater blast. The Japanese pilots flew directly into anti-aircraft fire that had already proven lethal that morning, and several were shot down before releasing their weapons. But 2 torpedoes got through, and they struck almost exactly where the ship was weakest. Both hits landed on the port side, tearing open fuel tanks and flooding compartments that had barely been patched days earlier. The ship immediately lost all power. Without power pumps that could have controlled the flooding went dead. Without pumps, seawater poured into compartment after compartment unchecked. Within minutes, Yorktown began to list to port, and the list kept getting worse. 10 degrees, then 17, then something closer to 26, the deck tilting so sharply that men could no longer stand on it without holding on to something bolted down. This was the moment damage control officers had to give Captain Buckmaster the diagnosis nobody wanted to hear. With no power, no pumps, and a list approaching 30 degrees, there was a very real danger the ship would simply roll over, taking everyone still aboard down with her. Buckmaster made the call that any responsible commander in that position had to make. At roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gave the order to abandon ship. What followed was, by almost every account that survived the war, remarkably disciplined. Nearly 2,200 men went into the water off a ship that was actively listing and could theoretically capsize at any moment, and the evacuation proceeded in an orderly sequence. Wounded men lowered first life rafts, distributed nearby destroyers, moving in close to pull survivors from the water. Casualties from the abandonment itself were kept remarkably low, given the scale of the operation a direct result of drills and discipline that had nothing to do with luck. Within roughly an hour, the bulk of the crew was off the ship and being pulled aboard escorting destroyers, watching from the water as the carrier they had just spent an entire day fighting to save sat there wounded, listing but still stubbornly refusing to go under. And this is the detail that almost never makes it into the shorter, cleaner versions of this story. Yorktown did not sink that afternoon. She did not sink that night. She sat there in the open Pacific for the better part of 2 days, damaged, abandoned, drifting, and very much still afloat, which meant somebody eventually had to make a decision about whether a ship that had already survived 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes was worth trying to save a second time. On the morning of June 6th, a decision was made that sounds on paper almost as reckless as the original 72-hour repair order. A volunteer salvage party, somewhere around 29 men, climbed back aboard the ship they had abandoned less than 2 days earlier, along with additional crew from the destroyer Hammond, which pulled alongside to supply power and pumping capacity directly to the wounded carrier. Their plan was straightforward and audacious at the same time. Lighten the ship by cutting away anything that added weight on the listing port side. Get pumps running again using power fed from Hammond, and tow the whole crippled mess back toward Pearl Harbor under the protection of the fleet. The tug Vireo had already taken her under tow. Slowly, painstakingly, the list began to improve. Fires that had reignited were brought back under control. For the second time in less than 2 weeks, a small group of exhausted men were trying to drag a dying aircraft carrier back from the edge through sheer improvisation and refused acceptance of the obvious verdict that the ship was finished. They were close. Survivors later described a genuine growing confidence aboard that afternoon that they might actually pull it off, that Yorktown might make it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power after everything she had already survived. Nobody aboard that salvage crew or aboard the Hammond, tied up directly alongside her, knew that a Japanese submarine had spent the better part of 2 days quietly stalking the task force, waiting for exactly this moment for the wounded carrier to slow to a crawl, exposed with a destroyer parked directly against her hull. At 1:31 in the afternoon on June 6th, that submarine, the I-168, slipped inside the destroyer screen completely undetected and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from close range. What happened in the next 4 minutes would decide whether the 72-hour miracle that helped win the Battle of Midway would end in salvation or in the deepest kind of tragedy. And by the time the water settled, the men still aboard both ships would learn that surviving 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes meant absolutely nothing if the 4th attack found its mark before help could arrive. The torpedoes from the I-168 crossed the water in under a minute. There was no time for the destroyer Hammond to maneuver. No time for anyone standing on Yorktown's listing deck to do anything but watch. One torpedo struck the Hammond directly amidships and broke her in half. She sank in less than 4 minutes, taking 79 of her crew down with her. 2 more torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's already wounded hull, tearing open compartments that the salvage crew had spent the entire morning fighting to seal. The ship that had survived 3 bombs, 2 earlier torpedoes, an abandonment, and a desperate reboarding now had a hole in her that no amount of welding was going to fix. This is where we pick up the story of the men who rebuilt an aircraft carrier in 72 hours, and what their impossible repair job actually meant for the rest of the war that followed. Yorktown did not sink immediately after the I-168 attack. She hung on through the rest of that afternoon and through the night, listing further with every passing hour, and at 5:58 in the morning, on June 7, 1942, she finally rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific. The salvage crew had already been pulled off by then. Nobody else died in those final moments. But for the men who had spent 3 sleepless days in Pearl Harbor with torches and prefabricated steel plates patching a hull that engineers said needed 90 days, the news landed like a verdict on their work. The ship they rebuilt was gone. And in the days immediately following, some of them had to sit with an uncomfortable question nobody wanted to say out loud. Had the rushed repairs actually held, or had those hurried welds been the reason she went down as fast as she did once the second torpedo attack found her? Back in Tokyo, Japanese Naval Command initially had no idea how badly they had actually lost at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto's staff spent the first days after the battle working from wildly optimistic damage reports, some of which claimed American carriers sunk that had never even been present. When the true scale of the defeat became clear, 4 fleet carriers gone, roughly 248 aircraft destroyed, and more than 3,050 men killed. The reaction inside the Imperial Japanese Navy was not panic, it was concealment. Wounded sailors returning to Japan were quarantined and forbidden from speaking to anyone, including their own families, about what had actually happened. Officers who had commanded the doomed carriers were reassigned quietly, rather than publicly held accountable. The Japanese public was told Midway had been a victory. For the men who ran Japan's combined fleet, the truth of what 4 burned carriers actually meant for the rest of the war was something they buried rather than confronted. Here is the number that mattered more than any single battle report. Japan lost roughly 110 of its most experienced aircraft mechanics and technicians at Midway, men who had spent years learning how to keep a carrier's air wing flying under combat conditions, and Japan's training pipeline had no fast way to replace them. The United States, meanwhile, had just proven something entirely different 8 days before the battle even started. It had proven that a wrecked carrier did not have to be written off. It could be dragged back from the edge of total loss and returned to the fight in days instead of months. That asymmetry, one side that could rebuild what it lost, and one side that increasingly could not, is the real story underneath the smoke of June 4, 1942. But the loss of the Yorktown herself so soon after that rebuilding miracle created a genuine crisis of confidence back home. A formal Navy Board of Inquiry convened to review the decision to send Yorktown back into combat with unfinished repairs, and the review process was not gentle. Investigators asked pointed questions about whether Pearl Harbor's repair yard had cut corners that directly contributed to the speed of her eventual sinking. Some officers speaking off the record suggested Captain Buckmaster's decision to send a salvage crew back aboard a listing abandoned ship with a destroyer tied up directly alongside her hull. In open water, had been reckless, precisely the kind of decision that had exposed the Hammond to a submarine that never should have been able to get that close undetected. For a period of weeks, the entire philosophy behind the 72-hour repair, The idea that speed should sometimes override standard procedure was genuinely in question inside the Navy's engineering leadership. Newspapers back home did not yet know the details, but inside the service, a real argument was underway about whether what happened at Pearl Harbor in late May had been brilliant improvisation or a dangerous shortcut that had ultimately cost more than it saved. The verdict that eventually settled that argument came from a battle 4 months later, nearly 1,900 miles to the south, near a small group of islands most Americans had never heard of before 1942. October 26, 1942. The Santa Cruz Islands, in the waters northeast of Guadalcanal. By this point in the war, the United States Pacific Fleet had a serious problem, and it was not a hypothetical one anymore. Lexington was gone lost at Coral Sea. Yorktown was gone lost at Midway. Wasp had just been sunk off Guadalcanal by a Japanese submarine torpedo in September. That left exactly 2 fleet carriers standing between the entire United States Navy and a Japanese force still determined to retake Guadalcanal and break the American foothold in the South Pacific. Hornet and Enterprise. 2 carriers again against an enemy that still had numbers on its side. On the morning of October 26th, Japanese and American carrier forces found each other almost simultaneously, and both sides launched everything they had. Hornet took the worst of it. Wave after wave of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes tore into her, and by mid-afternoon she was dead in the water. Burning uncontrollably, eventually abandoned and scuttled. That night the 2nd American Fleet carrier lost to enemy action in 5 months. Enterprise did not escape untouched either. She took 2 direct bomb hits within a span of minutes. One struck near the forward elevator, tearing a hole through the flight deck and killing dozens of men instantly. The second slammed into the ship close to the hull, buckling structural plating below the waterline and jamming the steering gear so badly that for several terrifying minutes the ship could not be steered at all, forced to circle helplessly while more Japanese aircraft bore down on her. Damage control teams moved fast. Fires, smoke, screaming metal. Men dragging hoses over debris that used to be a flight deck. A jammed rudder fixed under fire, the ship regaining steering control just in time to avoid a second wave of attackers locking onto a stationary target. By the time the Japanese planes finally withdrew, Enterprise was still afloat, but she was in bad shape. Her flight deck cratered, her structure wounded below the waterline, casualties mounting into the dozens. And here was the brutal math facing Admiral William Halsey in the days that followed. Hornet was gone. Wasp was gone. Lexington and Yorktown were already gone. Enterprise, damaged and limping, was now the only operational American fleet carrier left anywhere in the Pacific Ocean. If she went into a repair yard for the standard 90 days that naval engineers would normally demand, the United States would have 0 fleet carriers defending Guadalcanal at the exact moment Japan was pouring reinforcements into the island to try to break the American position once and for all. This was the moment the lesson from the Yorktown's 72 hours came back deliberately, as doctrine rather than desperation. Enterprise limped into the harbor at Noumea, New Caledonia. Not Pearl Harbor, a forward base with none of the deep infrastructure of a major Navy yard, and repair crews were given a directive that echoed almost word for word what had happened 5 months earlier. Get her fighting again fast. Welders cut and shaped patch plates on site, exactly the same improvisational technique used on Yorktown's hull. Structural bracing went in temporarily, rather than permanently, prioritizing speed over textbook completeness. Elevator mechanisms that would normally require weeks of careful realignment were forced back into working order through direct hands-on labor rather than by-the-book procedure. In roughly 11 days, working around the clock in a forward base, with a fraction of Pearl Harbor's resources, Enterprise was patched seaworthy and combat-capable again. She sailed back into the fight, still not fully repaired, some compartments still shored up rather than rebuilt, exactly the same calculated trade-off that had sent Yorktown to Midway. And for a stretch of weeks in November 1942, during the critical naval battles fought around Guadalcanal, The USS Enterprise was the only fleet carrier the United States had operating anywhere in the Pacific theater. Sailors on other ships started calling her the Gray Ghost, partly because of her camouflage paint scheme, and partly because Japanese intelligence reports kept insisting she had already been sunk, unable to explain how a carrier reported destroyed kept appearing in battle after battle. She provided air cover during the pivotal naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November, a battle that directly determined whether Japan could land enough reinforcements to hold the island. American forces won that engagement. Guadalcanal held. And a damaged carrier, patched together in 11 days using a doctrine born from a wrecked hull in a Pearl Harbor dry dock 5 months earlier, was standing watch over the entire outcome. The pattern that started with one welder and 1,400 exhausted men working 3 sleepless days in May 1942 had by the end of that same year become official United States Navy strategy. Forward repair bases were expanded aggressively throughout the Pacific. Specialized repair ships, floating machine shops, essentially, were built and deployed directly behind the fleet, instead of thousands of miles back at Pearl Harbor or the American mainland. By 1944, the U.S. Navy operated a mobile logistics system so extensive that damaged carriers could sometimes be patched up at forward anchorages, like Ulithi Atoll, and returned to combat within days, rather than being sent all the way back to the continental United States. When Japanese kamikaze attacks began inflicting serious damage on the fleet in 1944 and 1945, the same doctrine of rapid forward improvised repair that had first been tested on the Yorktown's hull was already institutionalized, already trained, already standard operating procedure across the entire Navy. Compare that to what Japan was doing during those same years. Japanese shipyards, hammered by resource shortages and eventually by direct American bombing, could not replicate this kind of speed, even when they desperately needed to. Damaged Japanese carriers frequently sat in port for months awaiting repair, not because Japanese engineers lacked skill, but because the country lacked the industrial depth, the spare capacity, and, crucially, the forward logistics network to do what American repair crews had proven was possible as early as May 1942. By the final 2 years of the war, the United States was launching new fleet carriers at a pace that seems almost unbelievable in hindsight, more than 20 Essex-class carriers alone entering service between 1943 and 1945, while simultaneously running a repair and salvage operation that kept damaged ships fighting instead of sitting idle. Japan, unable to match either the new construction or the repair tempo, watched its carrier force shrink with every engagement, while the American fleet somehow kept growing, even as it kept getting hit. None of that would have looked achievable on paper back in May 1942, standing in a flooded dry dock at Pearl Harbor, staring at a 30-foot hole in the Yorktown's hull. The engineers who initially said 90 days were not wrong about the scope of the damage. They were simply working from an assumption that speed and thoroughness were the same conversation, that you could not have one without sacrificing the other. What that welder and the other 1,300 men in that dry dock proved in 72 brutal hours was that a wounded ship did not need to be perfect to be useful. It needed to be good enough to fight right now, while the fight still mattered. That single idea, tested first in desperation and validated 4 months later in the waters off the Santa Cruz Islands, became one of the quiet, unglamorous reasons the United States Navy was able to absorb catastrophic losses throughout 1942 and still come out the other side of that year with more carriers in the fight than it had going in. History remembers the pilots. It remembers Wade McCluskey finding the Japanese fleet with his fuel gauge nearly empty. It remembers the burning decks of Akagi and Kaga, the dramatic photographs the admirals and their decisions made under fire. What history rarely remembers is the sound of a welding torch at 2 a.m. inside a flooded dry dock, or the names of the men who decided that 90 days was a number that could be broken if enough people refused to accept it. Somewhere in a stack of old Navy Yard payroll records, there is a name attached to that torch. Nobody wrote it down for the history books. But the ship he helped patch together sailed into the most important naval battle of the Pacific War and helped change its outcome, and the method he and his crew improvised under an impossible deadline went on to keep the entire American carrier fleet alive through the darkest months of 1942, all the way to Guadalcanal and beyond. What almost nobody knows is what happened to those repair crews afterward, whether the Navy ever formally acknowledged what they had actually accomplished, or whether their names simply disappeared into the same silence that swallowed so many stories from that war. That question, and the strange, mostly forgotten postscript to the Yorktown's 72 hours, is where the final chapter of this story picks up. 72 hours to rebuild a warship, engineers said needed 90 days. A wounded carrier that helped sink 3 Japanese carriers at Midway, then took 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes and kept fighting anyway. A doctrine born out of pure desperation that went on to keep the American carrier fleet alive through the darkest months of 1942, all the way to Guadalcanal and beyond. That is the story so far. But there is one question we have not answered yet, and it might be the most important one in this entire 4-part story. What actually happened to the men who did the welding? Because the twist at the end of this story is not a battle, and it is not a number. It is something much quieter than that, and much harder to accept. The honest answer is almost nothing happened to them, at least not in the way you would expect after reading about what they pulled off. There was no ticker-tape parade for the shipfitters of Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. No medal ceremony in a rose garden. No newspaper headline naming the welder who spent 3 sleepless days inside a scorched compartment, patching a hole that a Japanese bomb had torn through the Yorktown's hull. When the ship went down at Midway, just 8 days after leaving dry dock, and then again when Enterprise absorbed similar punishment off Santa Cruz. 4 months later, the story the country heard was about pilots, about admirals, about the ships themselves. The repair crews went back to work almost immediately on the next damaged hull that limped into port because there was always a next one. That was simply what the job demanded of them, day after day, for the remainder of the war. This is not a story with a villain in it, and it is not a story where the men were deliberately erased out of spite. It is something more ordinary, and in its own way, more painful than that. Naval history in the years right after the war was written overwhelmingly from the bridge and from the cockpit, because that is where the drama seemed to live, the split-second decisions, the burning flight decks, the admirals staring at intercept reports. The dry dock, by comparison, looked like background noise, a place where a ship simply got fixed, as if fixing a torn-open hull in 72 hours instead of 90 days was a footnote rather than one of the reasons America had a fighting chance at Midway in the first place. Some of those workers we know from surviving Navy Yard employment records stayed at Pearl Harbor for the rest of the war, repairing ship after ship as the fighting moved steadily westward across the Pacific. Others eventually enlisted themselves, trading a welding torch for a rifle or a different uniform entirely. A great many simply went home when the war ended in 1945, back to ordinary civilian trades, and lived out the rest of their lives, never once being asked by anyone outside their own families what they had actually done during those 3 days in May 1942. There is a particular kind of quiet dignity in that, if you sit with it for a moment. Admiral Chester Nimitz. The man who gave the order that 90 days had to become 3 went on to become one of the most celebrated commanders in American military history. Promoted to Fleet Admiral present on the deck of the USS Missouri for the formal Japanese surrender in September 1945, his name attached permanently to the story of Midway in every textbook written since. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, who commanded the Yorktown through her final battle and made the excruciating call to abandon ship, rather than needlessly sacrifice his crew, went on to further command and was later awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that day. Their names survived because officers and their decisions were the currency history chose to remember. The men standing in the flooded bottom of Dry Dock No. 1 with torches in their hands, the ones whose decisions made those officers' decisions even possible, mostly did not get names attached to their story at all. They simply became the repair crew, a phrase used exactly once in most accounts of the battle, and then never mentioned again. But here is the thing worth sitting with because it changes how you should think about the entire 90 minutes you have just spent watching this story unfold. Their legacy was never really about being remembered as individuals. It was about what they proved was possible, and that lesson did not die with the Yorktown on the morning of June 7, 1942. It became something the United States Navy carried with it for the rest of the 20th century, and in some very real ways carries with it today. By the final 2 years of the Second World War, the doctrine those men essentially invented under deadline pressure at Pearl Harbor had become fully institutionalized across the entire Pacific Fleet. The Navy built an enormous mobile logistics apparatus specifically designed around the principle those welders proved in 3 days forward: repair ships, floating machine shops, mobile dry docks towed directly behind the advancing fleet instead of thousands of miles back at Pearl Harbor or the American mainland. At forward anchorages like Ulithi Atoll, damaged carriers that would once have needed to sail all the way home for repairs could instead be patched, resupplied, and returned to combat within days. When Japanese kamikaze attacks began tearing into American carriers in 1944 and 1945, inflicting damage in some cases just as severe as what Yorktown suffered at Midway, crews already knew the doctrine. Assess fast. Patch what needs patching. Get the ship fighting again before the enemy can capitalize on the gap. It was no longer improvisation born of desperation. It was standard operating procedure, trained and drilled, directly descended from 3 days in a Pearl Harbor dry dock in May 1942. That doctrine did not stay confined to the Second World War either. During the Korean War, forward-deployed repair ships and rapid battle damage assessment teams kept carriers like the USS Valley Forge and USS Princeton operating on tight combat schedules off the Korean coast, drawing directly on procedures first proven under fire at Midway. In Vietnam, the same underlying philosophy treats speed of return to service as a weapon in its own right, rather than a secondary concern behind textbook thoroughness, shaped how the Navy handled battle damage to carriers operating on Yankee Station. And this is not simply ancient institutional memory. Modern United States Navy damage control training taught today to every sailor who serves aboard a surface combatant still traces its philosophical roots directly back to the lessons drawn from Yorktown and Enterprise in 1942. The core idea that speed and improvisation applied by well-trained crews under pressure can sometimes matter more than perfect procedure completed too late to help. Naval historians estimate that the rapid repair doctrine born in that dry dock directly contributed to keeping at minimum 2 or 3 fleet carriers in active Pacific service during 1942. Alone ships that by every conventional engineering standard should have been sitting in a shipyard queue instead of fighting at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. In a theater of war where the United States started 1942 with barely more carriers than Japan, that margin was not a footnote. It may have been the difference between winning the Pacific War in 3 years and losing enough ground early on that the entire timeline of the conflict looked completely different. But if you take only one lesson away from 4 parts of this story, it should probably not be about welding technique or repair timelines at all. It should be about what almost stopped this from happening in the first place. Because remember, the initial estimate from experienced naval engineers was not wrong on the merits. 90 days was, by every normal standard of 1942, naval engineering a completely reasonable and professionally responsible number. The men who pushed back against Nimitz's 3-day order were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were doing exactly what their training told them to do, protecting a warship, and the thousands of sailors who would eventually crew her from the very real danger of sending a structurally compromised hull into combat. What actually changed the outcome at Pearl Harbor was not a brilliant technical insight nobody else had thought of. It was a willingness at the very top of the command chain to accept a genuinely uncomfortable level of risk, because the alternative, arriving at Midway with only 2 carriers instead of 3, carried a risk that was almost certainly worse. This is a pattern that shows up again and again across the history of the Second World War. And it is worth naming a couple of other examples briefly, because it reframes everything you have just watched. The Higgins boat, the shallow draft landing craft that carried American troops onto the beaches at Normandy and across the Pacific, was initially dismissed by much of the naval establishment as an unproven civilian design from a small Louisiana boat builder with no military pedigree at all. It went on to become, in Dwight Eisenhower's own later assessment, one of the pieces of equipment that most directly won the war. The proximity fuse, a radar-triggered artillery shell that dramatically improved anti-aircraft accuracy, was considered so risky and unproven by conservative ordnance officers that early production was nearly shelved entirely before it went on to become one of the most closely guarded technical secrets of the entire war, credited with saving countless Allied ships from kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. In every one of these stories, the pattern repeats. An idea gets dismissed initially, not because it is stupid, but because it is genuinely risky, and risk is precisely the thing that institutions quite reasonably are built to minimize. The stories that actually change the course of a war are usually the ones where somebody with the authority to accept that risk decided the cost of playing it safe was higher than the cost of being wrong. That tension has not gone away simply because the Second World War ended 80 years ago. Walk into almost any modern military procurement debate, or for that matter, almost any large organization anywhere, trying to decide whether to bet on an unproven idea, and you will find the exact same argument playing out in different clothing. Established procedure exists for extremely good reasons, built out of decades of hard-earned experience about what happens when corners get cut carelessly. But there is a very fine, very important line between a corner cut carelessly and a corner cut deliberately by people who understand exactly what they are risking and have calculated that the alternative is worse. Chester Nimitz did not gamble the Yorktown recklessly in May 1942. He looked at a decrypted Japanese battle plan, did the math on what 2 carriers against 4 actually meant for the entire Pacific War, and made a calculated bet that a rushed, imperfect ship was worth more than a perfect ship arriving too late to matter. That distinction between recklessness and calculated risk, accepted with clear eyes, is really the entire lesson sitting underneath this whole story. And now the detail that ties this entire 4-part story together in a way that very few people who have heard the story of Midway ever actually connect. Most retellings of the battle treat the Yorktown's 72-hour repair as a fascinating but ultimately isolated piece of trivia, an impressive footnote sitting off to the side of the main narrative about McCluskey finding the Japanese fleet, about 3 burning carriers, about the turning point of the Pacific War. But naval historians who have gone back through the repair logs of 1942 and 1943 have traced something that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story at all. The specific improvisational techniques used on Yorktown, the on-site patch fabrication, the use of temporary structural bracing instead of full replacement, the decision to keep repair crews working aboard a ship even after she got underway were documented, studied, and directly incorporated into official Navy repair manuals within the following year. In other words, this was not simply a lucky one-time miracle that happened to work out. It became doctrine on paper adopted formally precisely because the Navy recognized what had actually been proven in that dry dock, and made a conscious decision to institutionalize it rather than let it disappear as an unrepeated anecdote. And there is one more thread worth pulling before we close this out. The submarine that ultimately sank the Yorktown on June 7, 1942, the I-168, had spent the better part of 2 days stalking the American task force, waiting patiently for exactly the moment when the wounded carrier would be at her most vulnerable, slowed to a crawl under tow, with a destroyer tied up directly alongside her hull. In a strange and largely forgotten postscript, that same submarine went on to survive combat operations for another 2 years, before finally being sunk by American aircraft near Truk Atoll in 1944. Some of her crew were captured, and post-war interrogation records suggest her commanding officer genuinely believed right up until the moment he fired those final torpedoes that he was finishing off a ship already so badly damaged it barely mattered whether he attacked it at all. He had no way of knowing that the vessel drifting in front of his periscope had already just days earlier helped sink 3 of his own Navy's fleet carriers, using a flight deck that a repair crew back in Hawaii had rebuilt from a smoking ruin in less time than it takes most modern shipyards to file the paperwork for a routine maintenance job. So here is where this story actually lands, once you put all 4 parts of it back together. It begins with a single, nameless welder among roughly 1,400 men crammed into a dry dock at Pearl Harbor, told that the impossible now had exactly 3 days to become possible. It runs through a carrier that should have needed 90 days launching dive bombers that helped sink 3 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway just 8 days after leaving dry dock. It survives 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes in a single afternoon, sinks anyway. 2 days later, to a submarine nobody saw coming, and somehow, through the doctrine those repair crews left behind, keep saving ships for the rest of the war, anyway, at Santa Cruz at Guadalcanal, and in forward anchorages all across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Roughly 2 to 3 fleet carriers were kept in active service during the most desperate stretch of 1942 because of what those men proved was achievable when speed became the priority instead of perfection. That is not a small number in a war where the United States started the year with barely enough carriers to field a fight at all. None of it happened because somebody had a flash of genius nobody else could have thought of. It happened because a group of ordinary tradesmen told their job was impossible, decided to do it anyway, and because the man giving the order was willing to accept a level of risk that every trained instinct in the room told him to reject. That is the actual story underneath the smoke and the burning flight decks and the admirals making history on the bridge. It is a story about the difference between what procedure says is possible and what desperate disciplined people can actually do when the stakes leave them no other option. Somewhere in a stack of 70-year-old Navy Yard payroll records, there is still a name attached to the torch that helped save the Battle of Midway. Nobody ever wrote it down for history. But the ship he helped rebuild changed the outcome of a war, and the method he helped invent under an impossible deadline is still in some form keeping sailors alive today. Sometimes the men who change the course of history are never the ones standing on the bridge. Sometimes they are simply the ones who refuse to put down the torch.